Alright, hello, welcome back everybody. PayPal, Patreon, and the YouTube super whatever buttons are all down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. And you can get access to these graphs for free and hundreds of other graphs across all kinds of similar or different subjects through the Google Drive folder linked in the description below. So for the first time, we're going to actually have a yearly update on population levels of US states, plus Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. So going down in rough order of population size. California was climbing through most of its history up until the last decade or so, and now it's kind of started undulating around between mostly 39 and 40. Went back down into the 38 range for a bit, but has been climbing back up from that now. And over the course of last year, 2025, it went up a tiny bit from 39.4 up to 39.5 million. Texas effectively continues infinitely going upwards and upwards, although not advisable as it's an extremely hot climate state, and also is throwing itself headlong into the AI data center cult, so it's going to put even more strain on its isolated, poorly run power grid as things go forward, let alone the needs of a growing population. Last year, it went up from 31.9 to 32.4 million. Florida continues going infinitely upwards, as jokingly, every person who goes over the age of 60 apparently immediately moves down there. And last year, they had a really big jump from 23.8 up to 24.3 million. New York State climbed up until the 70s and 80s and went flat for a bit before climbing up a little bit again until the last 10 or 15 years, where it's basically stayed flat right around 20 and did go up a bit last year from a flat 20 up to 20.1 million. Pennsylvania has been really slowly, really gradually climbing over the course of time. Although during the 70s and 80s, it did hit a stall and a bit of a decline, but it has resumed going upwards since then, and actually last year climbed by a larger than usual amount from 13.1 up to 13.2 million. Illinois is one of the states that's actually declining a bit. It was climbing until the 70s and 80s stall that many different states saw, and then climbed again up until around the late 2000s, 2010s, and has gradually tipped over into a very slow decline, although last year dropped down by about 100,000 from 12.7 down to 12.6 million. Ohio was climbing fast until the 70s and 80s, and it went flat, but then it resumed climbing just more slowly and has continued upwards at a more gradual but steady pace. Last year, climbing upwards from 11.9 up to a flat 12 million. Georgia was climbing very slowly, then hit a period of rapid growth a few decades ago, before, over the past 2 decades or so, switching over back into more gradual, slower growth, but still going upwards. Last year climbed by about 110,000 from 11.3 up to 11.41 million. North Carolina was growing at a steady pace for a few decades, and then 2 or 3 decades ago, it tipped upwards into a much steeper climb that it's been on ever since. Last year, growing from 11.15 up to 11.38 million. Michigan was growing up until the 70s and 80s, where it went flat briefly and then went flat and has basically stayed roughly along the same line ever since, going up and down in different phases. Last year, going up by a bit from 10.15 from 10.19 up to 10.24 million. New Jersey has kind of taken stair steps, growing rapidly up until the 70s and 80s, where it stalled, then it grew again until the 2010s, where it stalled for a bit. And now, post 2020, it has been growing upwards again. And last year took a big jump upwards from 9.6 up to 9.74 million. Virginia has continued a pretty steady growth trend over the course of time, and last year went from 8.88 to 8.96 million. Washington similarly has maintained the same rough trend of growth over the course of decades, and last year went from 8 up to 8.11 million. Arizona, a triple degree temperature, inhospitable desert state with already enormous high energy and water strain that is only expanding due to still growing population that is also then attracting industries and companies there that are also very high energy and water usage. Anyone who's remotely honest with themselves knows this is going to end very, very badly. Anyways, last year they continued going upwards by 180,000 from 7.62 up to 7.8 million. Tennessee has pretty solidly stayed going upwards over time, and last year continued upwards from 7.32 up to 7.39 million. Massachusetts took similar stair steps to New Jersey, hitting a stall in the 70s and 80s, hitting another stall in the 2000s or 2010s, but going upwards since then, and last year going from 7.2 up to 7.28 million. Indiana was growing, hit that one particular stall around the 70s and 80s, like many others, before resuming the same upward trajectory as before. And last year crossed over into 7 million from 6.97 up to 7.01. I apologize if you hear the heater turning on in the background. Missouri has roughly stayed the same, climbing upwards over time, though they did have a bit of a slowdown or stall around the 70s and 80s, like many others. And they last year went from 6.27 up to 6.32 million. Maryland actually should have been first before Missouri, and they had the 70s and 80s stall, but resumed the same upward trajectory after that and have continued ever since. Last year, going from 6.27 up to 6.36 million. Colorado has continued going upwards at a decently steep trajectory. They did have a stall around the 70s or 80s, but theirs was shorter and not by as much. And last year, they went from 6.01 up to 6.07 million. Wisconsin had a longer stall around the middle and has slowed down in growth since then and is coming down and and is seeming to transition towards more of a plateau probably. Last year it still grew from 5.97 up to 6.02 million. Minnesota has continued on roughly the same upward trajectory, and last year went from 5.83 up to 5.87 million. South Carolina, the state where I've been stranded ever since the infamous year 2020 happened. I used to live up in Fairbanks, Alaska, where I'd love to return home to, but that would require an income of at least $800 a month, the amount I used to earn before 2020 happened, back when I still had my old job back up home. But anyway, South Carolina has curved upwards into a steeper growth over time, and last year went from 5.6 up to 5.66 million, and last year went from 5.6 up to 5.66 million. Alabama has continued at a slow but roughly steady growth over time. It did have a bit of a stall around the middle portion, like a lot of others did. Last year, it went from 5.19 up to 5.24. Kentucky was growing pretty fast, but then hit that 70s or 80s stall and resumed growing since then, but at a slower pace. Last year, they went from 4.61 up to 4.66 million. Louisiana was once growing fast, but ever since the 70s, roughly, they've curved off into a undulating up and down pattern around a plateau of between 4.5 and 5 million. Last year, they went up by a tiny bit from 4.61 up to 4.62 million. Oregon was growing, hit that familiar snag, then resumed growing, but over the last 10 or 15 years, it's curved out and it's starting to level off. Last year, it did go up a bit from 4.27 up to 4.31 million. Oklahoma was growing fast, stalled out in the 70s and 80s, but then resumed growing after that, just at a slower pace than before. And last year went up from 4.12 up to 4.16 million. Connecticut was growing really fast until the 70s, roughly. Then it went flat, and since then it has grown very slowly and occasionally flattened out a few times. Last year, they went from 3.69 to 3.74. Utah has continued going upwards and upwards, and Utah went from 3.55 up to 3.62 million last year. Nevada, arguably even worse than Arizona, was going upwards, went upwards even more steeply, and then dropped to a slower incline, but is still going upwards, unfortunately. And This time last year went from 3.28 up to 3.37 million. Iowa was growing steadily but slowly and then went into a flat and wobbly undulation for a few decades. They've started a new upswing and last year grew from 3.24 up to 3.29 million. Arkansas was wobbling around for a while until they had a jump upwards a few decades back, went flat again, and then resumed going upwards, but at a slower, steady pace. Last year, they went from 3.11 up to 3.13 million. Kansas, after having a bit of a plateau and stall early on, decades ago, has resumed and continued growing very slowly and very steadily. And last year actually went up over 3 million from 2.98 up to 3.01. Mississippi has done the stair step pattern over time, having numerous different pauses and stalls and sometimes declines. Over the last 10 or 15 years, they've pretty much leveled off, though. And last year, they declined a bit, actually, from 2.95 down to 2.94 million. New Mexico, similar to Arizona, but thankfully is not flooding with as much of a ballooned population. They hit the same snag around the 70s that a lot of others did, but then resumed growing after that until the last 20 years or so, where they've kind of leveled off. Last year, they actually continued decreasing from 2.15 down to 2.13 million. Idaho was growing steadily, hit that 70s or 80s stall for a bit, and over time has actually curved upwards into a steeper growth. Last year, they went from 2.03 up to 2.06 million. Nebraska has had a pretty steady, mostly uninterrupted growth trend over time, just shallow and slow. And last year, they went from 2.02 up to 2.04 million. West Virginia was actually higher in population way back in the 50s than it is today. They were declining until the 60s or 70s, where they jumped upwards but then fell back down by the 80s, and have undulated ever since then in the upper ones. Last year, they basically stayed flat at 1.77 million at both ends of the year. Hawaii was growing for most of its time up until the last 15 years or so. Once it hit the 2010s, they kind of leveled off. Although over the course of last year, they did get a sudden jump upwards by 30,000 from 1.43 up to 1.46 million. Maine was one of the stair step pattern ones over time, and they were stalled out for a while until just the last few years where they've started going upwards again. And last year went from 1.41 up to 1.42 million. New Hampshire was growing steadily over time until the last decade or two. They went flat for a while, but similar to Maine, they, over the last couple of years, suddenly started growing a bit again. Although last year they stayed about the same at 1.42. Montana was growing for a while and then hit a decline phase around the middle that they then recovered from and have been continuing upwards since. And last year they went up by 5,000 from 1.145 up to 1.15 million. Rhode Island was growing up until the 70s or 80s where it went flat and resumed growing after that, but at a much slower, steadier pace. And last year they jumped up by 15,000 from 1.15 million up to 1.13. Delaware was growing for a bit, then the 70s and 80s happened, and they actually declined a bit over that time before resuming growth since then that they have continued. And last year they jumped up by 23,000 from 1.06 million up to 1.083. South Dakota was actually stable for a while until the last 2 or 3 decades where they've been going upwards. And last year they went up from 935,000 up to 937. North Dakota was growing, stalled, grew again, then declined down to a lower plateau that they had an upswing from until the last 10 years or so, where their growth has now slowed out. And last year they went up by 1,000 from 799 up to 800. Alaska, my home and preferred residence, had very uneven, undulating stair patterns and eventually stalled out and plateaued off at a population roughly a bit below 750 and has basically gone up and down between 750 and 730 for the last 15 years or so, Last year, they jumped back up from 737 up to 747,000. Vermont was flat for a decade or two, had a large upswing around the 70s, 80s, or 90s, and then has since then basically leveled out and stayed at about the same. And last year, they climbed a bit from 645,000 up to 648. And a state with the smallest population, Wyoming. And Wyoming has had a stair step, high heels break and fall pattern, growing, stopping, growing sharply, then breaking and collapsing down, growing again, and then dropping down again, but curving up again a little bit recently. Last year, they grew a bit from 589 up to 593,000. And then the two primary territories or districts with large populations, Puerto Rico, who was once up close to 4 million at its height, but has been declining since the 90s. And last year, it continued to decline, just only by 10,000 this time, from 3.18 down to 3.17 million. And Washington, D.C. was actually higher, back up in the 50s during the time that was still sort of immediately post World War II. And it undulated for a bit, saw a long, prolonged decline that it swung back up from until the last decade and a half or so, where it's now kind of leveled out, although it's fluctuating around. And over the last 3 years, it went from 702 down to 694. And now, as of the end of last year, start of this year, it jumped back up to 702,000 again. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. There's hundreds of other videos on the channel about similar and or different other subjects. PayPal, Patreon, YouTube, Super, Buttons, and whatever, all down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. Any financial support also helps with the ongoing perpetual maintenance of those free to access graphs that you can get through that Drive folder. That's linked in the description. There's a link in the top pinned comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.